Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about what I did in 42KL, or more exactly what I did with my Emacs in 42KL. So if you guys don't know what 42KL is, it's basically, it comes from 42, which is this French thing, which is like a coding boot camp, and they don't refer to themselves as a coding boot camp, but it's kind of like a coding boot camp. And you basically take this beginner's program and you learn Python or C. And I took the Python program and that took 1 week, but recently I took this C program for beginners and that took 1 month. And you can look online about 42 and there are mixed opinions about it. Some people, if you just go to the Instagram or whatever, it's usually quite positive, but if you go online, if you search hard enough, there's split opinions. Some people think it's not bad actually, and some people have issues with some of its style of teaching, especially that formatting standard. It has quite a strict formatting standard. So during the final exam, during most of the projects before the exam, we were allowed to use mostly anything, but we were encouraged to use Vim, mostly Vim and or Emacs. Since most people don't actually use Emacs, I was the only guy who used Emacs there. Most of them used Vim, but for most of the work you are actually also allowed to use VS Code. The exam, on the other hand, because it's completely offline, you are forced to use either Vim or Emacs. And because I'm a stubborn Emacs guy, and the reason why we're here is that we're supposed to have fun, right? So it doesn't matter who cares about productivity. People talk about, oh, it's just a tool, what matters is what you use with it. That's not true. We are here to have fun, and that's very important. Tools make a huge difference. If you learn, it might not make a difference in a year, but if you learn Vim for 5 years, if you learn Emacs for 5 years, it's going to make a huge difference. So because it's completely offline, during the exam I had to start from scratch, which is Emacs Q. During most of the project I had my own GitHub, so that was pretty easy. Even though I was not allowed to download packages, I could actually, there's always a workaround. Usually you git clone packages instead of using a package manager and all that stuff, so there's always a workaround. But in the exam I used this one, it's Emacs Q. I'm gonna start up an Emacs that is empty with no config. I'm going to do a test. So again, the program teaches you C, but of course, since everyone comes from a different background, some people with worse no coding background, there are issues with how people progress, and there's a huge gap between those who actually know the stuff and actually people who don't know what they're doing. So personally, I'm okay with the 42KL because it's the best we've got, because teaching programming is actually quite difficult, but it's not the best. I practiced writing this config under 10 minutes just to prepare for the exam, because the exam is 8 hours and it's worth it to have a minimal Emacs setup during the exam. So 8 hours is worth it to have an Emacs setup. So the first thing we do is a navigation, and I need to enable some stuff. So list mode, electric pair. Right, so the first thing is navigation. The selection here you can't see because I'm not sure if this is an OS problem or an Emacs problem. Usually if I select it on a different system, I can see what I select, but you can't see what I'm selecting, so it's okay, we'll move on. So, and the next is Windows stuff, next is buffer stuff, then we got some editing stuff, we got some compile stuff. So I'm gonna move this one here because I'll explain later. So navigation, I'm gonna put a video somewhere around here, show you what my keyboard setup looks like, and there's a reason why I chose this particular binding, and the reason why is because my keyboard has issues. If you can see the video right now, my keyboard has issues. The arrow keys actually require you to hold down the function key. It's a relatively cheap mechanical. I wanted a mechanical. Now I realize there are issues with it, but I tried fixing it by putting O-rings and better keycaps. It's not perfect, but I don't want to spend more money on this. This is good enough for now. The problem, of course, is that the arrow keys require function keys, so I had to come up with some other workaround. Obviously that's very annoying, having to hold the function key all the time, and it actually produces a lot of problems because that triggers other accidental shortcuts. So I binded this one backward word to ME, to Alt A, KBD, Alt A. Now the reason why I chose this one is because Alt A and Alt E makes perfect sense to me. And the letter A is generally the right side, and the letter E is on the the letter A is on the left side, the letter E on the right side, so it's generally directional. So what do I mean by directional? So if you watch some of my previous videos, directional simply means keys that are on the left side of the keyboard usually indicates going back in time or moving to the left of the buffer, and keys on the right side moving to the right of a buffer or opening a window to your right. So doing it this way, I discovered it's actually one of the best ideas I've come up with. It actually makes it really ergonomical. So backward word, now it works. And then I'm going to do the same for Alt E. So another advantage of this using A and E is because I almost don't have to look at all, because the default backward word and forward word is actually Alt B for backward word, Alt F for forward word, and this is kind of confusing because I haven't really took the time to actually get used to this. It's gonna take me a week or more, so I still don't like it that much because it's not directional. So now we have backward word, forward word, perfect. And then the next is editing. So I'm going to move to editing because that's actually the next important one. So we're going to do two. Mostly we're going to overwrite the kill line. Let's do the copy line first. Sorry, copy line. And this just copies the current line. So interactive. So if you don't know what interactive is, there's a lot of sources online. Basically, any function that opens the mini buffer, you use the interactive. So we're going to move to the beginning of the line, set mark, then we're going to move to the end of the line, then we're going to copy the region. So the function should be kill ring save, if I'm not mistaken. So there it is, it's correct. So kill ring save, that means copying without deleting. Region beginning, region end. So let's try it out. So we're going to copy this line. Already works perfectly well. So obviously this is not fun if you just have to type the function every time. So type the name of the function every time. So we're going to bind it to a key. So we're going to use KBD. Again, we don't care what we're overriding. It doesn't matter. It's just for the exam. So I've been doing this for a long time, so I usually have no issues with this. So we're going to do Control L, and that is bounded to RD copy line. So now let's try that one more time. It works perfectly well. So let's bind it to Control K. Works. Alright, so next we need to do window. So window in this case simply means you could also call it panel if you want. In other software you can also call it pane or panel if you want. In other software they might use the word pane, but in Emacs we call it window. So for example, say X3, Control X3 opens splits the pane to the right, but in Emacs it actually they call this split, they call it window. So what does Control X3 bind to? Split window right. So that's what we're going to do. Then Control 3. So instead of Control X3, which is kind of cumbersome, we're going to use Control 3. Then we're going to split window right. So let's try that out. Perfectly well. So if you notice, every time we have to type Control X0 or Control text O to navigate between left and right, and Control X0 to close it. So that's not very nice. So we're going to do that one. See, our shortcut already comes in handy. We're going to use Control X0 to delete the window. We're going to use Control O to actually navigate to the other window, or other pane if you like. See that? It's very fast. Alright, so another reason why is because we need to use compile. Another reason why we need the window pane, these three actions here, is because whenever we compile a C file, the compilation output actually happens on the right somewhere here. So it'd be very fast to actually go Control O and Control 0. So we'll show that later, but for now let's do the buffer actually. So the buffer means moving to another buffer, and in the exam sometimes I would use Control XB to actually move between questions, answers, and also something called a trace file. So a trace file is basically what you a trace file is a little bit like a compiler output, but it's mostly for the exam or the program checking the answers to your exam. What they do is that they compare your answer to the expected answer of the program, and if there's a difference, they notify you the difference. It means you did something wrong. So that's the trace. So it'd be quite annoying to actually do Control XB and then do that every time. So usually what you want to do is switch between two recent buffers that you've used recently. So the way we do that is, as usual, but we're gonna bind it to Control B, and we need, in this case, we actually need lambda because it's actually by default it's actually an interactive function. And then we're going to need a switch to buffer. Right, so if you do that, Control B, as you can see, it works perfectly well. So okay, so there's another problem. So if maybe you haven't realized it, but what if we open an actual let's say there's a file we don't want to see, that we don't actually want to visit that often. I don't want this file, and the problem now, of course, is that if I do Control B, I'm actually stuck between these two files. So I want a way to bury this file. So the way you would do that is you run the function Control bury buffer, Control MX, Alt X bury buffer. That actually hides it underneath your most recent files, so that it becomes the least recent files. So that means if I do Control B, see, now it works much better. So we're going to bind that to Control Z. I'm sorry, I think I accidentally buried this buffer. Right, so now it works perfectly well. Now if I wanted to hide this file, it's going to my scratch buffer instead. But actually, at least it works. So now here's the more fun part, compiling. So now you got everything set up. You want to compile a file. So usually what do you do when you compile a file? So usually what you would do is that you type gcc and you will type something like my main.c. In the example of the exam, you're actually expected to do this, but obviously in this case it's not a good idea to use that in your daily project, but for some reason in the exam you're expected to do this. So this will warn of unused variables, like in this case. So obviously you don't want to use this in your projects all the time, but this is the exam, so we got no choice, we have to use this. So I want to bind this one to a much more simple key binding and a much more complete key binding, something like this one to one of my mouse buttons, and this one to my to a mouse button but with a control, much better. So we're going to do that. So you're going to first define how would we create a compile. So we know how to do it in the terminal, but in Emacs you would do something like this. You would go to, so you would do something like compile, the compile command. So compile command by default actually runs mk. You would have to actually run your own compile. Right, so how will we do this? Control B. So we're going to compile. Now we can put any command like this, obviously, but that's not what we want. We want GCC. We want to combine some other files. So we're going to start first with directory files, default directory T, and then some regex. So this one I'm just memorizing at this point because regex is not the most pleasant thing in the world. Right, so now if we do this, it will work. So let's try it out. So if we do that, so you can see only files ending with .c. So this is not enough because, as you can see, it's a list, but we want it as a string. So we're going to do select that, and then we're going to do a string join. So now if you do a string join, you can see now it looks much better. It's separated by spaces, right? And we actually wrap that in a concat. I forgot that one. So GCC, we wrap that in a concat. Let's try that. So we have our command, so it works much better now. Alright, so something is missing, but let's try it out anyway. So let's say we bind that to, we put that in a function. So we're gonna run that one. Alright, so let's try this command. Okay, it works, but obviously this is not very useful because we are not running the function, running the executable itself. So we're going to Control B, going back. Then we're going to combine that with a.out. So now it works much better. Let's try it out. Okay, so now it runs, so you can see hello there, so it works. Now we're going back here, so we also want to bind this to a shortcut. Again, KBD. This time we're going to bound it to our mouse. Mouse. So my mouse has two buttons, that extra two buttons that I don't really use. So this is useful. So if you have one of those mouses with a lot of buttons, that'll be fun to use with Emacs because you can bind it to all kinds of stuff. So we're going to bind it to mouse 9, and we're going to put our function. So let's try it out. It works. So this is still not enough because we also need the GCC with the extra flags. So let's try that out. Control, So now it works because this is our full compile. Alright, so if in the middle of the exam I can just bury, so if, say for example I'm opening some trace file, whatever, some trace file, and I'm stuck with this file, so I can just bury. Now I'm going back to my previous buffers. Right, so that's it. I think, unless there's nothing to add on. The next video I'll try to make is actually on my previous. I need to redo some of my previous videos. The one on that workflow that involves git rev pass and git rev pass git work tree. So it's this very cool workflow. Some of you have already watched it. That allows me to actually add sort of like a hacking phase to your workflow. So for example, let's say I'm copying some random code on some large, relatively medium-sized code base I found online. I want to hack away at it as much as I like, and then always revert back to the previous state. I can add on that workflow and combining it with so many things, combined with git rev pass, with git work tree, with two branches, one called working, one for fuzzing. So the fuzzing has the assets and the executables, and the working is what I work on, and then combine that with two mouse buttons from my favorite mouse buttons. It becomes a very powerful workflow, so I can do almost anything. I can hack away at almost any project, and when I'm done with hacking, I'm not satisfied with it, or I did something completely wrong, I misunderstand the project, I can, at a click of a button, I can revert back to a previous state. So it's actually quite cool, and it's cool, but putting it and explaining it in a video is a bit tricky. And another problem, of course, this is Emacs, so Emacs is so flexible, it becomes a problem. You know, skill is not an issue, flexibility not an issue, but if you have two Emacs users coming from different backgrounds who work separately for 10 years, their setup is not going to be compatible at all. So it's a very powerful workflow, but it's very Emacsy. Thanks for watching, and goodbye. Have a good time. Bye.